How many years did you spend studying history? 10 years? 12 years? Maybe more? You know about World War II, the Holocaust, the mighty empires that reshaped the world. You know the names of dictators condemned by history, the battles carved into granite memorials, the atrocities prosecuted before international tribunals with cameras rolling and witnesses on the stand. But there are other stories. Stories that unfolded not in the shadows, but in broad daylight, in front of thousands, meticulously documented in government files, scientific reports, cabinet meeting minutes. Stories about millions of lives that vanished without a Nuremberg trial, without an International Day of Remembrance, without a single line in your textbooks. They weren't forgotten because no one knew. They were buried because the people in power needed them buried. A king celebrated as a philanthropist while his hands were busy cutting off children's fingers? A thriving city wiped off the map in a single night, then wiped from the history books for 75 years? The most respected doctors in the world performing live surgery on human beings without anesthesia? Children torn from their mother's arms by law, by the church, by the state? An intelligence agency of the world's freest nation secretly dosing its own citizens with hallucinogenic drugs? And a prime minister hailed as a hero, signing orders that left millions to starve while ships loaded with their grain sailed out of port every single day. These aren't stories from some other world. This is our world, our century. And in many cases, the consequences are still shaping the lives of millions of people right now. Real history is never as clean as what they teach you in school. It doesn't divide neatly into good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains. The greatest atrocities in history weren't carried out by monsters. They were carried out by ordinary people who believed they were doing the right thing, serving a higher purpose, acting in the interest of civilization. That's the most terrifying part. And that's exactly why you need to hear these stories. Number 1. The Crimes of Leopold II in the Congo. By the late 1800s, European powers were racing to carve up Africa. They treated an entire continent like a pie to be sliced and divided among themselves. In 1884 and 1885, these nations gathered at the Berlin Conference to redraw the map of Africa. Not a single African was invited. The fate of millions of people was decided by men with pens and paper. And in that scramble for land, one name stood out: King Leopold II of Belgium. He didn't want a small piece of the pie, he wanted an empire. Leopold came to power in 1865. Belgium was a small country, nothing like Britain or France when it came to colonial reach. But Leopold hungered for power. He wanted distant lands to exploit, resources to plunder, wealth to accumulate, and a legacy that would command respect. The Belgian parliament refused to fund his ambitions, so he decided to go it alone. He hired the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley to venture deep into Africa and sign agreements with indigenous leaders. He created an organization called the International Association of the Congo. On the surface, it claimed to fight the slave trade and bring civilization to the local population. Politicians in the United States, France, and Britain took him at his word. At the Berlin Conference in 1885, Leopold was officially recognized as the sovereign owner of a territory spanning roughly 2.3 million square kilometers, many times the size of Belgium itself. He named it the Congo Free State. It had a beautiful ring to it. The reality was the exact opposite. At first, Leopold focused on ivory. Then, in the 1890s, global demand for rubber surged as bicycles and eventually automobiles became widespread. The Congo's forests were filled with wild rubber trees. To Leopold, it was like stumbling onto a massive treasure chest. He imposed mandatory quotas on every village. Each month, a set amount of rubber had to be delivered. No exceptions, no excuses. To enforce compliance, he created an armed force called the Force Publique, made up mostly of African soldiers but commanded by European officers. They moved from village to village, armed and ready. Women and children were taken hostage, men were sent into the jungle to harvest rubber. Anyone who fell short of their quota faced beatings, had their homes burned down, or was killed. One of the most horrifying practices was the cutting off of hands. Soldiers were issued bullets and required to account for every single one. Each bullet needed proof of use, and that proof was the severed hand of someone who had been shot. Officers wanted to make sure ammunition wasn't wasted. The consequences were brutal beyond comprehension. Soldiers often cut off the hands of living people just to meet their count. In some cases, entire villages were attacked for the sole purpose of collecting hands. Children were not spared. There are photographs of children sitting and staring at their own severed hands, images that no one who has seen them can ever forget. Some Europeans began to speak out. E.D. Morel, a British shipping clerk, noticed that the ships heading to the Congo were loaded with weapons, while the ships returning were packed with rubber and ivory. That told him one thing: the people there were not being paid. He quit his job and founded an organization calling for reform in the Congo. Roger Casement, a British consul, filed detailed reports on what he witnessed firsthand. Joseph Conrad, after his own journey to the Congo, wrote Heart of Darkness, a novel exploring the savagery lurking beneath the surface of so-called civilization. Mark Twain also wrote a sharp satirical piece to expose Leopold to the American public. But the price the Congolese people paid was devastating. Many historians estimate that the population of the Congo was cut roughly in half over just about 20 years. From somewhere between 20 and 30 million people, the number may have dropped to around 10 million. The causes were murder, starvation from forced labor, the spread of disease, and a life lived in constant terror. Under mounting international pressure, the Belgian parliament forced Leopold to hand the Congo over to the Belgian state in 1908. What had been the king's private property became an official colony. Leopold received a large sum of money described as compensation. He was never put on trial. He died in 1909, still wearing his crown, and was given a state funeral. For years afterwards, statues and streets in Brussels still bore his name. In recent times, many people have demanded they be taken down, arguing that a man who caused so much suffering should not be honored. There are several reasons this story hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. It was the crime of an individual, not a major regime, which made it easier to overlook. Belgium maintained control over the Congo until 1960 and had little interest in revisiting its darkest chapter. And, painfully, the victims were African, and for far too long the world did not place the same value on African lives as it did on others. There was no major tribunal, no global day of remembrance. The events slowly faded into the footnotes of history, known by fewer and fewer people. The story of the Congo under Leopold II is a reminder that words like civilization and benevolence can sometimes be nothing more than a curtain. Behind them can hide greed, violence, and a cruelty that's almost impossible to imagine. History isn't just a collection of dry dates and timelines. It's the suffering of millions of real people who once lived, once hoped, and were swept into a nightmare they never asked for. Number 2. The 1921 Tulsa Massacre and Black Wall Street. To understand what happened in Tulsa, you have to go back and look at America in the years leading up to it. In 1865, the Civil War ended. Slavery was abolished, at least on paper. Black Americans were declared free. But freedom written into law didn't mean life actually changed overnight. In much of the South, black people were still treated with brutal cruelty. After the war, states began passing a series of laws known as Jim Crow laws. These laws forced black Americans to live completely separate from white Americans. They couldn't share the same schools, restaurants, buses, or bathrooms. When they tried to vote, they were blocked at every turn, hit with arbitrary poll taxes, trick literacy tests, and outright threats of violence. The courts offered little protection. White people who committed crimes against black people were rarely convicted. Around the same time, a violent extremist organization called the Ku Klux Klan was rising fast. They preached white supremacy and weren't afraid to use terror to enforce it. By the 1920s, they had millions of members, with deep ties to local police departments and governments across the country. It was in this climate of division and hatred that in the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a black community did something most people would have said was impossible. In the early 20th century, Tulsa was booming, fueled by the oil industry. Black residents were pushed to the north side of the city into a neighborhood called Greenwood. It was a segregated district, but the people who lived there refused to accept a life of poverty. Because of discrimination, they couldn't spend their money at white-owned businesses, so they built their own. They opened banks, grocery stores, movie theaters, hotels, medical clinics, and law offices. The money they earned stayed within the community and kept circulating. Within just a few years, Greenwood was thriving. There were over 600 black-owned businesses, along with their own newspapers, schools, churches, and libraries. Many families were genuinely prosperous. The main commercial strip earned the nickname Black Wall Street, a direct comparison to the famous financial district in New York City. The prominent leader, Booker T. Washington, visited and praised it as a symbol of self-reliance. Greenwood was living proof that Black Americans could build a prosperous life through their own hard work and determination. But that success made others deeply resentful. On May 30, 1921, a 19-year-old black man named Dick Rowland walked into a building in downtown Tulsa to use the restroom. Facilities for black people were scarce, so he had to go to an upper floor. In the elevator was a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page who operated the lift. What happened in those few seconds, nobody knows for certain. One theory is that Rowland stumbled and accidentally brushed against her. She screamed, he panicked and ran. The next day, the local paper, the Tulsa Tribune, ran a story with a headline accusing him of assaulting a white woman. Some coverage openly called for him to be lynched on the spot. Rowland was arrested. Rumors tore through the city. By the evening of May 31, hundreds of white men had gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. Many were armed. They were demanding he be punished that very night. A small group of armed black men, many of them World War I veterans, arrived at the courthouse and offered to help protect Rowland from a lynching. Police told them to leave. They came back with more people. Then, in the middle of the standoff, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired first. Within minutes, gunfire was everywhere. The crowd erupted, and what followed was full-scale, devastating violence. By dawn the next morning, thousands of white men were pouring into Greenwood. This wasn't a brawl. It looked like a coordinated attack. Homes were broken into and burned. Stores, schools, and churches went up in flames one by one. Residents fled in panic. Many were shot down in the streets. There were reports of planes circling above the neighborhood. Some witnesses said that from the air, people were shooting down or dropping incendiary materials. That detail remains disputed, but the horror on the ground is undeniable. In less than 16 hours, 35 city blocks were destroyed. More than 1,000 homes were reduced to ash. Somewhere between 100 and 300 black people were killed, and the exact number was never officially confirmed. 10,000 people lost their homes. Not a single white person was convicted of murder. As black residents were rounded up and held in detention areas, whatever homes remained were looted and then burned. The city then passed new expensive building codes that made rebuilding nearly impossible. Even so, the people of Greenwood tried to rebuild with their own hands. They received no insurance payouts, no government assistance. The neighborhood slowly came back to life, but it never recaptured the wealth and vitality it had before 1921. An investigation was opened. The final report placed the blame on the black community for having fought back. No one went to prison for what happened. What makes this story so chilling isn't just the fire itself, it's the silence that followed. For decades, Oklahoma textbooks didn't mention the massacre. Records went missing. Survivors rarely spoke about what they'd lived through, afraid of what might happen if they did. Many white Tulsans grew up never knowing a tragedy of that scale had taken place in their own city. It wasn't until 1997 that the state of Oklahoma established a commission to formally investigate. A report released in 2001 confirmed the full extent of the destruction and recommended reparations for survivors and their descendants. That recommendation was never passed into law. In 2021, 100 years after the massacre, the last 3 known survivors, each over 100 years old, testified before the United States Congress. They described their memories of the gunfire, the flames, and the fear they had carried their entire lives. That same year, President Joe Biden became the first sitting president to travel to Tulsa to mark the occasion. The Tulsa Massacre isn't just an old story. It shows us that the wealth gap between black and white Americans today didn't appear out of nowhere. Entire communities were destroyed through violence, through law, through decades of deliberate silence. Greenwood didn't fall because its people weren't capable. They had already proven the opposite. They worked hard, built schools, ran businesses, and raised families. That neighborhood fell because there were people who simply could not accept seeing them succeed. Someone once said that what was destroyed that night wasn't just lives, it was dreams that never got the chance to become anything at all. The story of Tulsa reminds us that history isn't always told in full. Some pages get torn out, some voices get buried. Remembering isn't about holding on to anger. It's about understanding what justice really means, what truth costs, and what it took for a community to stand up in the dark.
Number 3. Unit 731, The Crime Factory of the Japanese Empire, 1937 to 1945.
To understand Unit 731, you first have to look at Japan in the early 20th century. After the sweeping reforms of 1868, the country transformed at a breathtaking pace. They built factories, launched warships, and trained their military along Western lines. Within just a few decades, Japan had become one of Asia's dominant powers. In 1905, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. It was the first time an Asian nation had beaten a modern European power. That victory convinced many Japanese that their people were somehow exceptional, set apart from all others. Within the military, a dangerous ideology began to take hold. The belief spread that the Japanese were a superior race with a divine mission to lead Asia. The Chinese, the Koreans, and many other peoples were looked down upon. They were referred to by a dehumanizing term, maruta, meaning logs. When you reduce a human being to a piece of wood, it becomes far easier to stop seeing them as a life worth protecting. War was treated as sacred. Dying for the emperor was considered the highest honor a soldier could achieve. The ultimate goal of the militarists was control over China, Southeast Asia, and the islands of the Pacific, all under the banner of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria in northeastern China. By 1937, full-scale war between China and Japan had broken out, and in the shadows of that war, a horrifying program of human experimentation quietly began. The man at the center of it all was Shiro Ishii. Born in 1892 into a wealthy family, Ishii studied medicine at Kyoto University, one of Japan's most prestigious institutions, before joining the military as an army surgeon. He was brilliant, persuasive, and deeply ambitious. In 1928, Ishii traveled to Europe, where he studied the chemical weapons that had been deployed during World War I. What he came to realize was that beyond poison gas, there was something potentially far more destructive: infectious disease. Bacteria could kill on a massive scale, and they were cheap to produce. Ishii became convinced that Japan could develop an entirely new class of weapon. When he returned home, he proposed to the military the creation of a secret research facility, one that would use live human subjects for experimentation. The proposal was approved, and so Unit 731 was born. In 1936, near the city of Harbin in Manchuria, the Japanese military constructed an enormous complex in an area called Pingfang. On paper, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Locals were told it was a lumber mill. In reality, it housed a network of laboratories, detention cells, incinerators, bacteria storage facilities, and a small airstrip. Thousands of people worked there, including doctors, researchers, and guards. The prisoners brought inside were never called by their names. They were called maruta. Once a person has been reduced to a log, harming them becomes much easier to justify. The majority of the victims were Chinese, both captured soldiers and civilians. There were also Koreans, Russians living in Manchuria, and smaller numbers of Mongolians and Southeast Asians. Declassified documents later revealed that American and British prisoners of war were among them as well. They were held in dark cells and given just enough food to stay alive. The reason was coldly practical. The researchers needed them conscious and functional for continued experimentation. At Unit 731, prisoners were injected with bacteria responsible for plague, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Some were forced to consume contaminated food. Others were locked in rooms with plague-infected fleas carried by rats. As the diseases progressed, subjects were operated on while still alive without anesthesia. The researchers believed anesthesia would compromise their observations. Organs were removed while the heart was still beating. Everything was documented meticulously, recorded like any ordinary scientific study. There were pressure experiments, where prisoners were placed in sealed chambers, and the pressure was gradually increased until their bodies gave out. There were cold weather experiments, conducted during the brutal Manchurian winters, where prisoners were taken outside and forced to submerge their limbs in ice water until they froze solid. Researchers then tested various rewarming techniques to see which ones worked. Blood was drained from prisoners and replaced with saline to observe how long the body could survive. Animal blood was transfused into human subjects. Some prisoners were exposed to high doses of X-ray radiation to their reproductive organs to study the effects on fertility. Unit 731 also took its experiments into the field. Japanese aircraft dropped bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, including Ningbo and Changde. Numerous other cities were targeted as well. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of civilians died as a result of these deliberate outbreaks.
Beyond Unit 731, there were other units operating in parallel. Unit 100 in Changchun, Unit 1644 in Nanjing, Unit 8604 in Guangzhou. Japan's biological weapons program at the time was vast in scope. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union launched its invasion of Manchuria. Ishii ordered the destruction of all evidence. Documents were burned. Surviving prisoners were killed. Buildings were blown up. Rats and other infected animals were released into the surrounding area. In the aftermath, the Harbin region suffered a plague outbreak that persisted until 1947, killing still more people. Ishii instructed his staff to take the secret to their graves. Then he vanished. After the war, American forces tracked down Ishii and many of his associates. Rather than prosecuting them as war criminals, the United States, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, chose a different path. They offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for the full body of research data. The justification was that the data held significant value in the escalating arms race of the Cold War. As a result, Shiro Ishii was never tried. He lived out the rest of his life in Japan and died of cancer in 1959. Many of the doctors who had worked at Unit 731 went on to lead entirely normal careers, becoming professors, hospital directors, and executives at pharmaceutical companies. The Soviet Union did hold its own trial of several Unit 731 members in Khabarovsk in 1949, but the West largely dismissed it as a propaganda exercise. The documents detailing the agreement between the United States and the Unit 731 scientists remained classified for decades, only beginning to surface in the 1990s. For many years after the war, Unit 731 was barely mentioned in Japanese school textbooks. The Japanese government has never issued a formal apology specifically directed at the victims of the unit. In Tokyo, Yasukuni Shrine honors those who died in service of the emperor, including convicted Class A war criminals. Each time a Japanese official visits to pay their respects, it reignites tension with China and South Korea. That said, a number of Japanese journalists and researchers have worked to bring the truth to light. They dug through archives, tracked down survivors and witnesses, and published their findings so that future generations might better understand what actually happened.
Perhaps the hardest question is whether any of the data obtained from those experiments was ever actually used. The answer is that some of it was, referenced in later research on hypothermia treatment and infectious disease. That fact sparked a debate that has never fully been resolved. Some argue that data born from torture should never be used under any circumstances. Others contend that discarding it entirely would be a waste, so long as the purpose is saving lives. But this is not simply a story about the past. It is a reminder that science without ethics can become an instrument of atrocity. And when power and political interest enter the equation, justice itself can be traded away like a commodity. In Harbin today, what remains of the facility has been preserved as a museum documenting wartime atrocities. It opened in 1985, and every year visitors come to remember the victims. The story of Unit 731 reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature. When people stop seeing each other as human beings, every boundary becomes negotiable. All it takes is calling someone a log, and the things that a normal conscience would never permit suddenly become possible.
Number 4. The Bengal Famine of 1943, when the empire chose to let people starve. To understand the Bengal Famine of 1943, you have to look at the relationship between Britain and India at the time, not through the polished narrative of civilizing the natives, but through the lived reality of ordinary people. The British came to India for profit. Before colonial rule, India was one of the largest economies in the world, accounting for roughly a quarter of global output. After nearly 2 centuries under British control, that share had collapsed to around 4%. Researchers have estimated that the total wealth extracted from India, in today's terms, reached into the tens of trillions of dollars. The exploitation was quiet, but relentless. Farmers were forced to grow cotton, indigo, and opium for British markets instead of rice to feed their families. Indian goods exported abroad were hit with heavy tariffs, while British imports into India faced almost none. The handloom weaving industry, which had once sustained millions, slowly collapsed. The cost of running the colonial administration, the salaries of British officials, the upkeep of the military, was billed to India's own budget. The people being governed were taxed to pay for the system that controlled them. Most critically, India's food continued to be exported even in years of poor harvest. When people went hungry, rice still left the ports. That wasn't an accident, it was policy. Bengal, which today spans Bangladesh and the Indian state of West Bengal, was once the most fertile region on the subcontinent. Fed by the silt of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers, the land could yield multiple rice harvests a year. Its capital, Calcutta, was a major commercial hub, a bustling port through which goods flowed across the empire. On the surface, Bengal looked prosperous, but most of its farmers lived on the edge. Under a system known as zamindari, they owed high rents to landlords. What rice remained after paying rent was often barely enough to last a few months. One bad season, one flood, one spike in rice prices. That was all it took to push a family into debt. In 1943, several of those bad factors hit at once, and that fragility shattered into catastrophe. In October 1942, a powerful cyclone slammed into Bengal's coastline. Rice crops were destroyed, grain stores washed away. That was the natural disaster. Before the war, Bengal had also been importing rice from Burma, present-day Myanmar. In 1942, Japan seized the region, and that supply line was cut. Fearing a Japanese advance into Bengal, British authorities implemented a scorched earth policy. Thousands of boats, the primary means of transporting rice across the delta, were confiscated and destroyed. Bullock carts and bicycles were seized as well. Coastal granaries were demolished to keep them out of Japanese hands. The Japanese never came, but the food distribution network had been gutted. Rice existed in some places. The hungry lived in others, with no way to bridge the gap. At the same time, Calcutta had become a major logistics hub for Allied forces. Soldiers and workers flooded into the city, demand for food surged, and rice prices climbed sharply.
The government imposed no price controls. Merchants hoarded grain, waiting for prices to rise even further. The rice hadn't disappeared, it was sitting in the warehouses of those who could afford it. In 1943, Britain's Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. In the West, he's remembered as the defining symbol of anti-fascist resistance in World War II. But in the story of Bengal, his role is far more complicated. As the famine took hold, officials in India repeatedly sent urgent telegrams to London requesting rice imports from Australia and elsewhere. The War Cabinet refused. Ships were needed for the war effort, they said. Europe had to come first. Yet documents that surfaced later showed that grain was still being shipped out of India to other destinations during that same period. Australia had offered to send thousands of tons of wheat. The offer was rejected. Some officials in India who reported the rising death toll were reportedly asked to lower the numbers in their official dispatches. In meeting minutes and personal diaries, Churchill's contempt for Indians was recorded in his own words. Many historians argue that decisions to stockpile food reserves for future contingencies rather than redirect them to Bengal directly contributed to millions of deaths that could have been prevented. By the summer of 1943, the scenes in Calcutta were devastating. People poured in from the countryside looking for something to eat. They collapsed on the pavements. Each morning, government carts went through the streets collecting the bodies of those who had died in the night. In the villages, families sold off their land, their cattle, their belongings, piece by piece. Some parents sent their children to live with strangers, hoping they might survive. Women and children were forced into desperate circumstances just to trade for a meal. People ate leaves, bark, rats, whatever could be swallowed. Bodies weakened by starvation fell quickly to cholera, malaria, and typhoid. Many who had survived the hunger itself died shortly after from disease. The colonial government initially reported around 1.5 million deaths. Later research has put the real number at somewhere between 3 and 4 million, possibly higher when accounting for those who died from illness in the aftermath. Record-keeping at the time was incomplete. Many people died in remote villages, unrecorded, unmourned by any official count. They simply disappeared. In 1981, the Bengali economist Amartya Sen published his landmark work, Poverty and Famines. His argument was striking. Famines don't necessarily happen because food runs out. They happen when poor people can no longer afford to buy it. He showed that Bengal's rice output in 1943 was not significantly lower than in previous years. The crisis came from prices spiraling out of reach and a complete failure of distribution. Those with money could still buy rice. Those without could not. India gained independence in 1947. No trials were ever held to assign responsibility for the Bengal famine. Churchill continued to be celebrated in Britain, and in 1953 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. In British schools, the story of Bengal is rarely taught. In India, the event is remembered, though it is often framed broadly as a consequence of wartime disruption. To this day, the British government has never issued a formal apology for the Bengal famine of 1943. The Bengal famine was not the only mass starvation India endured under colonial rule. From the late 19th century into the early 20th, a series of devastating famines killed tens of millions more. The story of 1943 is a reminder that catastrophe is not always nature's doing. Human decisions, how food is managed, how suffering is regarded, who is considered worth saving, can either pull people back from the edge or push them over it. This is not simply a story about war. It is a story about responsibility. When those in power choose to prioritize their own interests over the lives of ordinary people, the consequences can echo across generations.
Number 5. Indigenous residential schools, a silent erasure in Canada and Australia.
In the 19th century, the British arrived in Canada and Australia with grand ambitions. They wanted land. They wanted to build nations in their own image. But those lands were already home to indigenous peoples who had lived there for generations, communities with their own languages, their own customs, their own spiritual connections to the rivers and mountains around them. To the colonial governments, those communities were obstacles standing in the way of the future they had planned. In the early days, violent conflict broke out across many regions. But over time, the outside world began paying attention, and open massacres became harder to hide. The authorities needed a different approach, something quieter, but just as effective at erasing indigenous culture. The thinking behind it was captured in a now infamous statement by Richard Henry Pratt, the man who founded the first Native American boarding school in the United States in 1879. He said that you had to kill the Indian and the child in order to save the human being. That wasn't a metaphor. It became the guiding principle for policy across multiple countries. In 1879, the Canadian government commissioned Nicholas Flood Davin to study the American boarding school model. His report argued that if you wanted to change Indigenous peoples, you had to separate children from their families as early as possible and place them in environments fully controlled by white society. The government accepted those recommendations. Starting in 1883, the first residential schools opened, run by churches but funded by the state. By 1920, the Indian Act had been amended to make attendance compulsory. Children between the ages of 7 and 15 were required to attend residential schools. Parents who refused could be thrown in jail. Police came to villages and took children away. Some were taken while their parents weren't even home. Some were separated from their mothers in hospitals moments after birth. Many families had no idea where their children had been sent. When the children arrived at school, their hair was cut, their names were replaced with English or French ones, and their traditional clothing was confiscated. Siblings were separated and forbidden from speaking to each other. Children were banned from speaking their native languages. Those who broke the rules were beaten, forced to stand for hours at a time, or locked in dark rooms. After a few years, many children had completely forgotten their mother tongue. When they finally returned home, they could no longer hold a conversation with their own parents. The bonds that held families together slowly came undone. In the classroom, boys were taught farming and carpentry. Girls learned cooking and sewing. The children were told that their ancestors' beliefs were primitive and backward. History was taught from the perspective of the conquerors. The goal was never to help these children thrive. It was to turn them into cheap, compliant labor. Survivors have described daily violence. Children were beaten for minor infractions. Some were starved. Some were locked in small, dark rooms for extended periods. Far worse were the sexual abuses. Priests, teachers, and staff members exploited the isolation of these children to commit horrific acts. The children had no one to turn to. When they did speak up, they were sometimes punished for lying. Another truth that came to light years later shocked many people. Some schools had used children as subjects in nutritional experiments. The children were deliberately underfed so researchers could study the effects on their health. Those studies were government-funded. The deplorable living conditions allowed tuberculosis to spread rapidly. In some schools, the death toll from disease was devastating. Many children died and were buried right on school grounds, without grave markers, without any notification to their families. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada estimated that at least 4,100 children died within the residential school system. The true number may be far higher, as records were lost or destroyed over time. Then in 2021, in Kamloops, hundreds of unmarked graves were discovered on the grounds of a former school. The news sent shockwaves around the world. For many Canadians, it was the first time they truly grasped the depth of trauma that Indigenous communities had endured. Across the ocean, Australia had its own version of the same story. When the British arrived in 1788, they declared the continent Terra Nullius, meaning land belonging to no one. In reality, hundreds of Indigenous communities had been living there for tens of thousands of years. Violent conflict marked the early years of colonization, but eventually the government shifted to a policy of assimilation. Indigenous children, especially those with lighter skin, were taken from their families and raised in white households and institutions. The goal was to ensure that future generations would no longer identify as Indigenous. From roughly 1910 to 1970, enormous numbers of children were forcibly removed from their families.
They came to be known as the stolen generations. A 1997 report titled "Bringing Them Home" estimated that hundreds of thousands of children had been affected. Some mothers desperately tried to hide their children. There are accounts of women rubbing charcoal under their children's skin to make them appear darker. Even so, police still came and took them. Many people from that generation grew up not knowing their real names or where they came from. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper stood before Canada's Parliament and issued a formal apology. That same year, Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered an apology to the stolen generations. Many people wept when they heard those words. The apologies were an important step, but they couldn't undo the damage. Suicide rates among Indigenous youth in Canada remain far higher than among non-Indigenous Canadians. In Australia, Indigenous life expectancy is significantly lower. Ancient languages are disappearing because fewer and fewer young people can speak them. What makes this history so devastating is that it wasn't born out of wartime chaos. It was codified into law. It had budgets, administrators, and the backing of parts of society. The last residential school in Canada didn't close until 1997. This isn't ancient history. Many of the people who lived inside those schools are still alive today. One survivor once said that he had taken his language, changed his name, and torn him from his family, but he still knew who he was. That statement speaks to something powerful. No matter how hard anyone tried, erasure doesn't simply disappear. The story of Indigenous residential schools is a reminder that a people can be devastated without a single shot being fired. Sometimes the erasure happens in a classroom, in a lesson, in the silence of a child forced to forget their mother tongue before they ever understood what it was worth.
In the early 1950s, America was living in a state of deep anxiety. World War II had only recently ended. The Soviet Union successfully tested an atomic bomb in 1949. China had fallen to communism. The Korean War had broken out, and casualty reports were filling the news every single day. But what was keeping people in Washington up at night wasn't just bombs. They feared something far harder to see, something that could reach inside a person's mind and take control. During the Soviet show trials of the 1930s, many of the accused had confessed to crimes they could barely have committed. They spoke calmly, in vivid detail, with no visible signs of coercion. Then, during the Korean War, American prisoners of war appeared on television, criticizing their own country with what looked like genuine conviction. The West had a name for this: brainwashing, the idea that a person's thoughts could be rewritten through extreme methods. In closed-door meetings at the Central Intelligence Agency, better known as the CIA, the question being raised was deadly serious. Could an enemy take control of a person without that person even knowing it was happening? Could they turn a scientist, a general, even a president into a puppet? From that fear came a dangerous idea. If the enemy could do it, maybe America should find a way to do it too. Before the name Multra ever surfaced, the CIA had already been running secret programs. In 1950, they launched Project Bluebird, with the goal of protecting American agents from being brainwashed if captured, while also finding ways to extract information from enemy prisoners. In 1951, they followed that up with Project Artichoke, where the questions got bolder. Could you make a person carry out a dangerous act without them ever realizing what they were doing? These programs used drugs, hypnosis, and various methods of psychological manipulation. Building on that foundation, in 1953, a much larger operation was born, Project Multra. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Alan Dulles signed off on Multra. The man running it day to day was Sidney Gottlieb, a young chemist with a PhD. In the internal documents, the stated objective was fairly dry: research into substances capable of altering human behavior. Put more plainly, they wanted to find ways to influence what people thought, felt, and decided. The program received a significant share of the CIA's budget at the time, which made clear just how seriously the agency took it. Multra wasn't a single experiment. It was an umbrella covering roughly 150 sub-projects involving more than 80 institutions, including prestigious universities like Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, and Johns Hopkins. Many of the researchers receiving funding had no idea the money was coming from the CIA.
Some may have suspected but didn't ask too many questions. In its early phase, Multra's central focus was a hallucinogenic drug called LSD. It was a substance capable of dramatically distorting perception and thought, causing people to see or hear things that weren't there. The CIA believed that even in tiny doses, LSD could leave a person unable to control themselves for hours. They hoped it might unlock secrets buried in someone's mind, force people to tell the truth, or make them more susceptible to manipulation. They purchased a massive supply of LSD from a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland, essentially buying up nearly the entire available stock at the time. Then the experiments began, often without the clear consent of those involved. One of the most controversial chapters was an operation called Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, hired women to lure men back to these apartments, then secretly slipped LSD into their drinks. On the other side of a one-way mirror, CIA operatives watched and took notes, observing the reactions of people who had no idea they were being experimented on. Beyond that, psychiatric patients at several hospitals were given high doses of drugs for extended periods. Some were kept in isolation, cut off from light and sound. Others were subjected to electroshock therapy far beyond what any standard treatment called for. Many of these patients came out of it having lost their memories, their ability to function, their sense of self. Prison inmates were also used as test subjects. Some were offered reduced sentences or small payments to participate, but they were never fully told what the risks were. American soldiers were given drugs during test sessions too, sometimes told only that they were undergoing routine medical checks. One well-known case is that of James Stanley, a military serviceman who was given LSD without his knowledge. He later suffered serious psychological problems, and when he sued the government, he received no compensation. In Canada, a psychiatrist named Donald E. Cameron at McGill University was pursuing a method he believed could erase old memories and build a new personality from scratch. He kept patients in drug-induced sleep for weeks at a time, combined with electroshock treatments and the repeated playback of recorded messages looped for hours on end. Many of his patients had come in with mild anxiety or mild depression. They left having lost their memories, their basic skills, forced to relearn how to function from the beginning. Years later, the Canadian government paid compensation to some of the victims. In November 1953, a scientist named Frank Olson fell from a hotel window in New York and died. The initial story was that he had taken his own life. It later came out that shortly before his death, he had been given LSD at a work meeting without any warning. His family never believed the official story. Years later, a formal review concluded his death may have been a homicide, but no one was ever prosecuted. By 1973, with the threat of investigation closing in, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of a large volume of Multra documents. Even so, a collection of financial records that had been missed was discovered in 1977. Senator Ted Kennedy held public hearings, and for the first time, the American public heard clearly what had been happening in the shadows for 2 decades. Despite the shock and outrage, most of the people who ran the program never went to prison. Some had already retired, others had died before the story broke. Many victims received no compensation because the destruction of the files had left too little evidence to work with. The story of Multra raises something worth sitting with. Even in a democracy, when covert operations go without meaningful oversight, power can travel very far in a very dark direction. The people involved weren't necessarily monsters. Many of them likely believed they were protecting their country. And that's exactly what makes the story so unsettling. Things don't always go wrong because someone wanted them to. Sometimes it starts with fear, with the desire to win, and then, step by step, a line gets crossed that no one even noticed they were approaching.
For over 300 years, Indonesia was a colony of the Netherlands. When the country finally won its independence, it had to find its own footing in a world that had split into 2 rival camps: the United States and the Western powers on one side, the Soviet Union and China on the other. That tension became known as the Cold War. The man leading Indonesia at the time was Sukarno. He was the hero of the independence struggle, and he put forward an idea called Nasakom, a vision of blending nationalism, religion, and communism within a single nation. He believed these 3 great forces could coexist. Reality, as it turned out, was far more complicated. The Indonesian military, known as the TNI, was deeply anti-communist. Trained by the Americans, they grew increasingly alarmed by the rise of the communist left. Meanwhile, the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, was expanding at a remarkable pace. By 1965, it had become the third largest communist party in the world, operating legally, contesting elections, claiming millions of members, and running a wide network of organizations, including peasant unions, women's groups, and labor associations. Alongside this were powerful Islamic organizations like Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, deeply embedded in Indonesian society. Many of their members were deeply suspicious of the PKI, especially over land disputes and fundamental differences in belief. Sukarno tried to keep the balance between all three forces. By 1965, that balance was beginning to crack. In the early hours of October 1st, 1965, a group of military officers calling themselves the September 30th Movement kidnapped and killed 6 senior army generals. Their bodies were thrown into a well in an area known as Lubang Buaya. The group claimed they had acted to stop a coup plot against Sukarno, but within hours, a general named Suharto moved swiftly to take command of the military and crush the uprising. Who was really behind the events of that night remains one of history's unresolved questions. Some say the PKI was responsible. Others believe Suharto had prior knowledge or seized the moment for his own ends. There is also a theory that a small faction acted on its own. Whatever the truth, what happened next shocked the world. In the aftermath, the military under Suharto took control of the media. The story of the 6 generals was told with chilling detail. The press reported they had been brutally tortured. Forensic experts would later confirm that many of those details were inaccurate, but by then, people already believed them. The PKI was branded as godless, as a threat to religion. In a society where faith ran deep, that framing sparked outrage. Rumors spread that communists were drawing up lists to strike first. Fear swept through villages across the country. And when people are afraid, violence is never far behind. The killing was not carried out by the military alone. It spread to the local level. The army provided lists of suspected communists, along with weapons, transportation, and oversight of the killings. In many areas, Islamic militia joined in directly. Young men from Ansor, a youth wing of Nahdlatul Ulama, went door to door in the night. People whose names appeared on those lists were dragged from their homes in front of their families. Many were taken to riverbeds, open fields, and remote forests, then killed. Bodies were thrown into rivers or buried in mass graves. Witnesses recalled that the rivers of Java were at times filled with the dead. What made it most terrifying was neighbor turning against neighbor. A land dispute, an old argument, a petty grudge, any of it could be enough for someone to be labeled a communist. Some informed on others simply to protect themselves, afraid of being the next one suspected. In Bali, the violence was equally brutal. Deep-rooted tensions over social hierarchy pulled entire families into cycles of retribution. Tens of thousands of Balinese are estimated to have died within just a few months. In parts of Sumatra, ethnic Chinese Indonesians were also targeted. Many had no connection to the PKI, yet were killed simply because of their background. The total death toll is estimated somewhere between 500,000 and over 1 million people. Not everyone was killed outright. Hundreds of thousands were imprisoned without trial. One of the most notorious detention sites was the island of Buru, where prisoners were forced into years of hard labor. The writer Pramudia Ananta Tor was held there for 14 years. He had no paper, no pen. He kept his stories alive by telling them aloud to fellow prisoners. Those stories would eventually become the celebrated Buru Quartet. In all, more than 1 million people are estimated to have been imprisoned during this period. Indonesia's position on the world map made it strategically vital. The country sits near the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth, and it was rich in resources like oil and rubber. The United States was paying close attention. Declassified documents show that the American embassy in Jakarta provided the Indonesian military with lists of PKI members. A U.S. official named Robert Martins later acknowledged his role in compiling those lists. Ambassador Marshall Green sent reports back to Washington confirming the handover.
The United Kingdom also supplied communications equipment to the Indonesian military. Throughout the violence, Washington raised no serious public objection. Britain, too, has been accused of stoking tensions through information operations, in part because of concerns over Sukarno's confrontational stance toward Malaysia. In the years that followed, Suharto gradually pushed Sukarno out of power and built a system he called the New Order, which would last more than 30 decades. The PTI was banned outright. Anyone suspected of communist ties would lose their job, their chances of education, their future. Every year, a propaganda film about the events of September 30th was broadcast on national television. At the same time, Indonesia's economy was open to Western investment. Foreign companies moved in to extract the country's resources. The Suharto family accumulated enormous wealth. Transparency International would later rank Suharto among the most corrupt leaders in modern history. He held power until 1998, when he finally resigned. After Suharto fell, the press began to speak more openly about 1965. Then, in 2012, a documentary by filmmaker Joshua Oppenheimer called The Act of Killing stunned audiences around the world. The film invited men who had taken part in the killings to reenact their crimes on camera. Many spoke with what looked like pride, as though the murders had been a kind of achievement. President Joko Widodo acknowledged that serious human rights violations had taken place, but to this day, no formal apology has come from the Indonesian state. Many mass graves remain unexcavated. The families of victims live with their silence. The Indonesian massacres are not simply the story of one country. They show what happens when fear is deliberately inflamed. When a group of people is labeled the enemy, violence can erupt with terrifying speed. They also show how great powers can quietly place their own interests above the lives of others. More than 60 years have passed. Many young Indonesians still do not know what really happened to their grandparents. When history is left incomplete, the wound cannot heal. The story of 1965 is a reminder that the truth needs to be faced. Only when people are willing to speak and willing to listen can a society truly move forward without repeating the darkness of the past.
6 stories, 6 continents, millions of victims, one common thread. None of these stories unfolded in complete darkness. None of them lacked witnesses, records, or people who knew the truth. Leopold II had an entire army, thousands of employees, and missionaries who saw everything firsthand. Tulsa happened in broad daylight in front of an entire city. Unit 731 left behind thousands of pages of meticulous scientific reports. The residential schools had government funding, church sponsorship, and the full backing of the law. MKULTR left 20,000 pages of financial records behind, even after someone deliberately destroyed the rest. These stories weren't forgotten because no one knew. They were forgotten because the people in power didn't want anyone to remember. There's a question every person should ask themselves when reading any textbook, watching any historical documentary, or listening to any national holiday speech. Who gets to tell this story, and who doesn't? Official history, the kind taught in schools, carved into monuments, and broadcast on national holidays, is not the whole truth. It's the portion of truth that those in power chose to share. The rest gets filed away as the past, dismissed as already settled, labeled propaganda, or simply never mentioned until the last generation of witnesses is gone. The Congolese had no printing press to tell their story in 1900. Black residents of Tulsa had no television station in 1921. Indigenous children in residential schools had no social media to speak out. MKULTR victims didn't even know they were victims, so they had nothing to report. Silence is never accidental. It's always engineered. The perpetrators were not monsters. This is perhaps the hardest lesson to swallow. Leopold II was not a monster crawling up from hell. He was a well-educated king who loved the arts, patronized architecture, and was praised by the European press as a philanthropist. Sidney Gottlieb grew flowers and danced folk dances. Ian Cameron was president of the World Psychiatric Association. The doctors of Unit 731 graduated from the most prestigious medical schools in Japan. Canadian officials who ran the residential schools attended church every Sunday and genuinely believed they were saving the souls of indigenous children. None of that diminishes their crimes, but it raises a far more unsettling question than simply branding them monsters. If ordinary, intelligent, well-educated people could do these things, what is it that stops us, under different circumstances, from doing the same? The answer isn't innate goodness. The answer is institutions, accountability, and a culture that refuses to tolerate the dehumanization of any person, whoever they may be. The moment a system starts calling human beings maruta, logs, savages in need of civilization, or national security threats, that's when we need to stop and ask, where does this road lead? Across all 6 stories, there is one heartbreaking constant. No one was punished the way they deserved to be. Leopold II died a king and was given a state funeral. Ishii opened a private clinic and died peacefully at 67. Gottlieb retired to tend his goats. Cameron died before the truth came out. The men who burned Greenwood never stood trial. Those who ran the residential schools were buried in church cemeteries beneath proper headstones. And the victims? They waited decades for an apology. Many died before it came. When it finally did, there was usually no compensation. When there was compensation, it was rarely enough. And when it was materially sufficient, nothing could give back what had been taken. The language, the memories, the generations, the dignity. This isn't a reason for despair. It's a reason to understand that prevention will always matter more than punishment, because punishment comes after the crime has already been committed, and the victims cannot be brought back to life. Why listen to these stories? Not to satisfy some morbid curiosity about evil, not to feel relieved that you weren't alive back then, but because history is not the past, it is the blueprint for the present. The mechanisms that produced these tragedies, dehumanizing the vulnerable, cloaking power in secrecy, weaponizing science, silencing victims, did not vanish in 1945, or 1973, or 1997. They are operating right now in more sophisticated forms, with more modern language, and sometimes on an even larger scale. Knowing history doesn't guarantee you won't repeat it, but not knowing it almost certainly means you will, because you won't recognize that you're already walking the same road that once led to the edge of an abyss. There's a small detail from the Tulsa story that rarely gets mentioned. After Greenwood was burned to the ground, while the ashes were still warm, while thousands of people were still held in makeshift detention camps, some black residents walked back to their empty lots and started clearing the rubble. No insurance, no government aid, no justice, nothing but ash and bare hands. They rebuilt, not because they forgave the people who did it, not because they believed justice was coming, but because the memory of what had once existed was powerful enough to become the blueprint for what could exist again. That's also why we tell these stories, not to drown in the darkness of the past, but to remember clearly enough that we never let it happen again. History does not speak for itself. It needs people who choose to listen and choose to pass it on.